In the shadow of the Arkansas Ozarks, where mist curled low across pine ridges and wolves howled at night, stood a crooked little cabin. The logs were weather-beaten, moss clung to the roof, and the chimney always smoked with the smell of simmering stew. The cabin belonged to Widow Margaret Lyle, a woman in her late 50s with sharp gray eyes, wiry hair tucked under a bonnet, and a quiet smile that hid more than it revealed. Travelers along the dirt road often stopped there, lured by the smell of her cooking. She greeted them kindly, offered bowls of stew and thick bread, and asked little or no payment. To strangers, she seemed a saint of the wilderness. But in nearby towns, whispers followed her name. Some said her stew was too rich, too filling, almost strange. Others claimed men had gone missing after lodging with her. No one had ever proven a thing. At the tavern in Eureka Springs, men nursed mugs of whiskey and traded stories about the widow. Her husband died sudden-like, one would mutter. Maybe sickness, another replied. But an old trapper leaned closer. No, boys. He was mean as a rattler, always beating her black and blue. Then one night, he vanished, never found. The younger men laughed nervously, brushing it off as backwoods gossip. Yet, when night fell and they rode past the Ozarks Road, none dared glance too long at the widow's cabin. Her stew was famous, but so were the rumors. One brisk autumn evening in 1874, Thomas Rourke, a 22-year-old wanderer, came stumbling along that dirt path. His boots were split, his hat frayed, and his stomach ached from hunger. He had left Missouri in search of work, carrying only a satchel and a heart full of restless hope. The smell of stew wafted through the trees, rich with herbs and meat. His legs carried him straight to the cabin. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes scanned him, hungry, weary, harmless. She smiled gently. "You must be starved," she said. "Come in, son. My stew will put life back in you." The cabin's interior was warm and dim, lit by firelight dancing on the log walls. A pot bubbled on the hearth, releasing a fragrance so rich Thomas nearly wept. He sat at her rough wooden table as Margaret ladled steaming stew into a bowl. Chunks of tender meat, potatoes, carrots, wild herbs, every bite was heavenly. "You've saved me, ma'am," Thomas said between mouthfuls. Margaret's smile deepened, though her eyes stayed unreadable. When the bowl was empty, Thomas leaned back with a sigh of relief. But soon, an odd heaviness washed over him. His eyelids grew heavy. His limbs tingled, weak. Margaret only sat across from him, hands folded neatly, watching. The room spun. Through half-lidded eyes, Thomas caught sight of a shelf by the wall. Boots lined it, far too many boots for one woman. Beside them lay a satchel, a silver watch, and a locket. "Traveler's things," his mind whispered. He tried to rise, but his legs buckled. Margaret's shadow loomed over him, her expression calm, almost motherly. "Hush now," she murmured. "Sleep'll take you." Darkness closed around him. Thomas dreamed of voices echoing in a hollow space. Men's voices, groaning, crying out. He saw pale faces seated around Margaret's table, bowls in hand, yet none moved. Their eyes were wide and glassy. Chains clinked. A cold wind blew through the dream, carrying the stench of earth and rot. One face leaned close, whispering in his ear, "Wake up, wake, before it's too late." With a gasp, Thomas awoke. His arms were bound to a chair, his legs tied with rope. A dim lantern flickered, casting shadows across a cellar lined with shelves of herbs and jars. And bones. Some animal, some human. He could not tell. Margaret descended the steps, lantern in hand. "You'll quiet down now," she said, voice soft but firm. "The forest has no use for noisy men." Terror seized him. Margaret sat on a stool, her eyes glinting in the lantern light. Her voice was steady as she told her story. Years ago, her husband had been a cruel drunk. He beat her near to death more times than she could count. One night, when his fists threatened to end her, she fought back with an axe. He never rose again. She buried him beneath the cabin. After that, drifters came by, some kind, some wicked. A few tried to harm her. She defended herself. Soon, killing became survival. Survival became habit. The stew, she whispered, keeps the world from asking questions. Thomas's voice cracked with desperation. Please, ma'am, I ain't like them. I'm just looking for work, a chance to start a life. I'd never harm you. Something flickered in Margaret's expression. For a moment, her hard mask slipped. His words tugged at a memory. Her son, born weak and buried before his first birthday. You've got his eyes, she muttered, looking away. That night, Margaret left Thomas bound but alive. Alone by the hearth upstairs, she stared into the flames. Her hands trembled as she held her wedding portrait, remembering the years of bruises and hunger. Her heart wrestled between old habits and the fragile thread of mercy she had not felt in years. Down in the cellar, Thomas whispered prayers into the dark. Margaret dreamed that night. Travelers she had slain stood around her bed, their faces pale, hollow-eyed. Yet they did not scream. They did not curse her. One stepped forward, placing a cold hand on her arm. End it, he whispered. Let this one live. Redemption waits for you. She awoke, heart pounding. For the first time in decades, she felt the weight of her sins pressing like iron on her chest. At dawn, Margaret descended into the cellar. Thomas, weak but alive, lifted his head. His eyes searched hers, fearful, yet pitying. With trembling hands, she untied the ropes. Run, boy, she whispered. Don't look back. Some roads aren't meant to be walked twice. Thomas staggered to his feet. Their eyes met one last time, hers heavy with sorrow, his wide with relief. Then he fled into the forest. Branches tore at his clothes, roots tangled his boots, but Thomas ran until his lungs burned. The morning air filled his chest, sweet as freedom. Behind him, the cabin stood silent, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. He wanted to keep running forever, yet something gnawed at him. Why had she spared him? Why had her eyes looked not like a killer's, but like a grieving mother's? Days later, Thomas staggered into town. He told the sheriff fragments of the truth: bones in the cellar, missing travelers, poisoned stew. A posse rode out at once, but when they reached the cabin, it was nothing but charred ruins. It had burned to the ground, still smoldering. No trace of Margaret remained. In the ashes, the sheriff's men uncovered a shallow grave beneath the hearth. Bones, male, older, likely her husband. But of Margaret herself, there was no sign. Some claimed she perished in the fire. Others whispered she slipped into the woods, becoming a shadow of the forest. Her stew pot lay blackened and cracked among the ruins. Years passed. Thomas found work, built a farm, married a good woman. He had children who played in the fields, laughter ringing through the valley. Yet in the quiet hours when the wind whistled through the pines, he remembered Margaret. He remembered the cellar, the bones, the mercy. Though the world branded her a monster, he wondered if she had been more victim than villain. Children in the Ozarks grew up hearing ghost stories of Widow Lyle's stew. Parents warned them, "Don't wander the roads at night, or the widow will feed you." But Thomas, when his children asked, told them a different tale. She was a woman hurt more than anyone should be. She did terrible things, yes, but in the end, she found enough goodness to let a stranger live. His children listened wide-eyed, the lesson etched in their hearts. One bitter winter, A package arrived at Thomas's door with no sender's name. Inside was a tarnished locket, the very one he had glimpsed in her cabin long ago. He opened it. Inside was a faded drawing of a baby boy. Tucked beside it was a scrap of paper, handwriting shaky and frail. "You reminded me of him. Live kindly, where I could not. M.L." Thomas's hands trembled. Tears blurred his eyes. That night by the fire, Thomas wept quietly. He realized Margaret hadn't fled into the woods to haunt the living. She had given him the last piece of her humanity she could not carry anymore. The world would forever remember her as a murderer, but he would remember her as a broken mother who, in her final act, chose mercy. The tale of Widow Lyle passed through generations. Some spoke of her as a witch, others as a monster. But in Thomas's family, the story was told differently, that even in the darkest soul, a spark of grace may survive, that sometimes the monster is only a wounded heart hidden behind cruelty, and that mercy, offered in the blackest of nights, can nourish more than any stew ever could.